international Dr. David Wilmson revealed his conversion to Islam over the radio to a mostly unsuspecting American audience, including his own parents. Now Associate Dean for Instructional Affairs at the American University in Cairo, he recalls what happened that day.
That was almost exactly 20 years ago, in late summer 1985, when I first announced publicly, I suppose, that I had adopted Islam. In fact, it had been almost a year before that, in 1984. But I decided that I would read into the religion before I ever announced to anyone. But my brother knew that I was interested in Islam and that actually was convinced with it, and he told me, as long as you're convinced, you should call yourself a Muslim and tell everyone. At the time I was working as a radio announcer at the community radio station KXCI in Tucson, Arizona, and it was, in fact, Eid al-Adha, the festival after the pilgrimage. And I thought this would be a good time to announce it, and I announced it publicly on the air. Immediately after that, I got a call from one of my listeners. I had a loyal following on my radio show, and she called and told me that she had felt that, in fact, I was a Muslim for quite some time while listening to me on the air, and that was encouraging.
Young David was not practicing any religion, but he was always trying to see the logic behind everything and endeavoring to make sense of life.
I had, it seems, for several years been looking for the correct faith or the correct religion that I should, or that I could follow, one that appeared to be internally consistent and logical. And I had been reading into all of the major religions of the world, and I hadn't really found anything that seemed to fit. Just when I started graduate school, I was required, in fact, to take a class on Islam because of my study of the Middle East and that sort of thing. And so I took a class called Islamic Thought, which was basically an introduction to the entire range of Islamic theology and history. The first thing that the professor did, he was an American, but he still seemed to at least respect Islam a great deal. And the first thing he did as he entered the class was to pronounce what's called in Arabic al-Basmala, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, in the name of Allah, the Compassionate, the Merciful. And then he proceeded to explain to us the very basic fundamentals of Islam, at which point I felt a surge of a very strange emotion that I had never felt before, sort of shock and recognition at the same time. And I thought to myself, well, I have believed this for a long time without realizing that I believed it, or that is specifically what I believe. And the professor himself said that one who can believe this, accept this, is in fact a Muslim. So I realized at that moment that I, in fact, was a Muslim without knowing it.
In spite of the overpowering feeling that swept him and captured his heart, converting to Islam was not a spur-of-the-moment decision for Dr. Wilmson.
I thought I would read into Islam before I announced, or even made a final decision, shall we say, to call myself a Muslim. Because I thought, well, I want to see if there's anything in the religion that I find to be impossible to believe. Because there were other religions, believe me, that I found that some of the basic things in them some of the basic doctrines were impossible to believe. So I thought I'll put Islam to that test as well. If there's anything in it that's impossible for me to believe, I can leave it. I'm free to do as I please. And I never found it. So after a year of reading into Islam, and at the same time I was learning Arabic, and so learning to read more and more in Arabic about Islam, I decided that I would, in fact, announce that I was a Muslim.
With his inner doubts and misgivings finally put to rest, and the overwhelming light of his newfound faith shining upon him, he started to enjoy the kind of freedom and relief he had always been seeking.
the feeling that I got from that was one of an extraordinary feeling of freedom. Freedom from a great deal of things that had been troubling me. Freedom from a great deal of the false religious doctrines that people had been trying to convince me were true. And a great deal of relief. And that feeling of relief, by the way, and freedom has not left me in 20 years. I felt that I had arrived at the actual truth of the matter, without having now to consider a lot of these other extraneous ideas. In fact, I could dismiss them. Not simply because I had made up my mind and that was the road I'm going to take, but also because Islam is, with its logic, it's a sublime logic. It equips one to be able to reject those arguments and those ideas.
Dr. Wilmsen and his twin brother Richard are the eldest among 6 brothers and sisters. He comes from a mostly Canadian family on his mother's side that had a great influence in shaping up his future. His grandfather, William A. Irwin, was professor of biblical languages who taught him Hebrew at the age of 6.
I came from a family like a lot of Americans, immigrants to the United States. My father's parents had just arrived when he was born, and when he was in his early 20s, I was born. My mother was from a Canadian family, and they had been in the country, well, they had been in North America longer than my father's family. And her family, I think, influenced me a great deal more than my father's family did. A long line of scholars. My great-grandfather was a scholar, my grandfather was a scholar, and my father is a scholar. And so I'm the 4th generation of scholars. My grandfather, I think, had the greatest effect on my mother's father, was a professor of Middle Eastern languages at the University of Chicago. Although he was Canadian, he was working in Chicago, where my mother was born. The only one of his children to be born within the United States, the rest are Canadian. He, when I was very young, taught me to read Hebrew. He was a scholar of the Christian scriptures, and Hebrew was very closely related to Arabic, so I think that when I finally grew up and chose my own field of study, I gravitated towards Semitic languages, especially Arabic. By way of anthropology, first. My father was an anthropologist, and so I went into anthropology, became interested in the Middle East because of, by way of anthropology, and then eventually became interested in the language of the Middle East itself as a subject of study.
The 4th generation of scholars, Dr. Wilmsen had a keen interest in anthropology that later developed into an academic career centered on Middle Eastern peoples and languages.
I think it was a natural progression to go from anthropology into the study of language, and in fact linguistics, because with anthropology, of course, it's the study of human beings in their natural environment, more or less. And I had become interested in, through that, in what they call pastoral peoples, traditional people who keep flocks of animals for a living. And I was interested in the American Indians of the area where I grew up, called the Navajo, who herd sheep for a living. And I became interested also, probably from my grandfather's influence, in the Arabian Bedouin. And I studied some Navajo language, and I knew that sooner or later I'd have to study Arabic as well. Although at the University of New Mexico, where I was, there was no Arabic to be had. So I transferred in graduate school to the University of Arizona, and Arizona is where I had grown up in any case, where there was a program in Arabic. Not necessarily thinking at first that I would actually go into Arabic as a field of study, but I was influenced there by one of my professors who immediately, after he suggested that I go into Arabic linguistics, immediately went on sabbatical, and I didn't see him until I left the university. But I followed his advice and went into Arabic linguistics as a field of study.
Dr. Wilmsen then traveled to Egypt to study at the American University in Cairo for 1 year. There, he lived in the poor neighborhood of Sayyida Zainab, to the astonishment of many of his colleagues.
When I first came to Egypt to study Arabic, I decided that instead of the other students, the way the other students that I was in the group with me were doing, they were living in neighborhoods, upscale neighborhoods close to the university, where anyone who spoke to them would speak English or French. I decided I'd rather live in a neighborhood, a more authentic Egyptian neighborhood, where people also spoke English, but they would rather speak to you in Arabic. And I thought, I came here to learn Arabic and to become fluent in it, and I'd rather live with the common folk of Egypt. So I chose a neighborhood that's also near the university, about a 20-minute walk away, called Sayyida Zainab, after the principal mosque in the area.
It was here where Dr. Wilmsen found his peace of mind and picked up the Egyptian rhythms of life.
The people of Sayyida Zainab, the neighborhood, are extraordinarily welcoming and open and conversational. They love to engage one in conversation. And the conditions of life, of course, are not the same as I was used to in my home in the United States. The neighborhood is more crowded. The apartments are smaller than one might expect. But I like to pride myself in being adaptable, and I adapted quite easily. And the people there, of course, were there to help me with any trouble that I may have, any trouble at all, really. Not that I didn't have any trouble, but I got to know everyone on the street, and they all knew me, were very welcoming towards me, and it was extraordinarily rewarding to live in the neighborhood for an entire year and to experience the rhythms of daily life and of the flow of the seasons throughout the year, and to experience the customs that people followed while they were living in somewhat of a traditional area in Cairo, and to get to understand the traditions myself and to participate in them. It was extraordinarily rewarding.
When he finally obtained his PhD, Dr. Wilmsen returned to Egypt in 1993 to work at the AUC.
Well, the first time I met Dr. Wilmsen, it was in 1993 when he came to assume his appointment as the director of the Arabic Studies and Translation Division. He had a very big challenge facing him at that time. We were waiting for him, in point of fact, in Cairo here, expecting him to do a lot of things for the members of this division and for the improvement of both the translation component and the Arabic studies for non-native speakers of Arabic. And he was up to it. He was up to the challenge facing him.
For most of my career here at the American University in Cairo, I was the director of Arabic and Translation Studies, which was right in my field, and it was actually a real pleasure to do that. And that was for the last 12 years, I think. And very recently, I have stepped out of that role and have become an associate dean, which means I'm now responsible for the Department of Translation, Arabic and Translation, and 4 other departments, which is greater responsibility. I still like to put the name Arabic and Translation Studies after my name when I write letters, for instance, because I still feel like I'm part of that department, and occasionally I will be teaching classes in that department, but I'm no longer the director.
For an academic who lived in both worlds, Dr. Williamson has his own vision of how the Muslim world can overcome the misconceptions in the West.
Islam is greatly misunderstood in the West, and I think especially in America, more so than in Europe. And there are long-standing historical reasons for that, but that misunderstanding, I think, has been amplified greatly since the events of September 2001. And there are political elements in the West, and especially in America, who are trying to exploit that, in my opinion, who don't really want the image of Islam to be clarified, or the understanding of Islam by Westerners to be increased. The way to combat that, of course, is the way they do it, is to start writing things and to produce television programs that are favorable towards Islam, or at least neutral. I think that if people in the West saw Muslims going about their daily lives in their normal, everyday contexts, that they would understand that, of course, Muslims are human beings just like they are, and we would make great steps towards reaching an understanding between the West and Islam.
For a stranger who meets him for the first time, his modesty does not obscure his high academic stature. He's a good listener who finds great pleasure in communicating with everybody, from top university professors to laymen. As a keen Muslim, Dr. Williamson is punctual in going to mosque for his prayers. It took Dr. Muhammad Mazyad, an Egyptian professor of medicine, a whole year to make up his mind and accept Dr. Williamson as husband to his daughter Samar. He had his own reasons for that.
It was really a difficult decision to accept Dr. David Williamson as a husband to my daughter, because it was not easy to be accepted according to our Egyptian tradition in the marriage conditions. And we are descendants of big families from the countryside, and they have all the traditions as Egyptian. And Dr. Abdullah, I called him Abdullah, and I like to nominate him Abdullah, because when he came to ask for the hand of my daughter, it just came to my mind that I will accept you and I will call you Abdullah. And Abdullah to me means Abdullah, and every Muslim is Abdullah.
My wife Summer, in fact, is not in Egypt right now. She's doing a PhD in economics in Scotland. And it's actually rather interesting or amusing, because what most Egyptian parents fear if they happen to marry their daughter to a foreign man, is that he will take her and move back to his own country. But I'm the one who stayed, and she's living abroad right now.
Over the years, Dr. Williamson produced many books, studies, book reviews, and conference papers. An outstanding contribution of his is the translation of Galal Amin's renowned book, Whatever Else Happened to the Egyptians, from the Revolution to the Age of Globalization. A prolific writer, Dr. Williamson spends a great deal of his time at home, working on his essays and research papers, even describing this as his hobby now after giving up fencing. Although he speaks 8 languages, Arabic is the dearest to his heart. Studying Egyptian and Levantine Arabic, Dr. Wilmsen had his PhD in Arabic linguistics, and mastering Cairene Arabic, he now moves on to assess the terminological variations in formal written Arabic.
Well, you'll read now in the popular press about the confessional stories of people who are studying Arabic. And one of the things they'll say, I've noticed this over and over again, they'll say, of course Arabic has its dialects and then it has its modern standard Arabic. And the dialects are as far apart as the Romance languages are. That statement about the dialects being that far apart is false.
The impression that a great many people have of the formal written code of Arabic from the Arabian Gulf to the Atlantic Ocean and Morocco is that it is a single monolithic entity. And it turns out that that's probably not true, but no one has researched this, or not many people have researched this. And I am finding that there are, in fact, regional differences, which I like to call dialects, of standard written Arabic. And I'm now conducting a study on that, which I will be presenting soon, inshallah, in September of this year.
For someone who dedicated a good deal of his life to translation, Dr. Wilmsen now has his eyes set on a new frontier to conquer.
I've been working with some people who are involved in a huge project of committing all of the important books of prophetic tradition called Hadith to electronic format for ease of scholarly reference. And one of the things I would like to do eventually is to begin translating some of the important books of Hadith. The first 6 books are the important ones. As far as I'm concerned, there are no good, or very few good translations of the prophetic traditions. And I think that someone like me, who is a native speaker of English but very good with Arabic, is almost obliged to undertake a project like that.
A moderate faithful himself, Dr. Wilmsen has great hopes for the Muslim world. Against the backdrop of Western misconceptions about Islam, he aspires to live in a world where tolerance prevails among Muslims.
I think what I'd like to see, I would really like to see in the Muslim world, while I'm still alive, inshallah, is greater unity amongst Muslims, more tolerance of diversity amongst Muslims, and more flexibility. I'll tell you what I mean. First of all, we all must realize that we are all a brotherhood of the same faith, regardless of each one's individual point of view. And everyone is responsible before Allah for his own understanding of the faith and his own application of it. And we need to be able to tolerate differences amongst ourselves. Islam is supposed to be a religion of tolerance and a religion of flexibility. By flexibility, I think we need to have some inventiveness in our thought processes in order to face the tremendous challenges of the modern world that are facing us as Muslims and facing the tradition of Islam. I would hope to see these things realized within my lifetime.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم طه
ما أنزلنا عليك القرآن لتشقى إلا تذكرة لمن يخشى تنزيلا ممن خلق الأرض والسماوات العلى الرحمن على العرش استوى له ما في السماوات وما في الأرض وما بينهما وما تحت الثرى وإن تجهر بالقول فإنه يعلم السر وأخفى.
I was totally deviant while going astray. No faith, no belief, lost all the way. Now I'm a Muslim and God I pray. For all His blessings, my voice I raise. In my God I believe, no equal has He. Lord of the universe, compassionate to me. Muhammad the Prophet taught me the way to be honest and truthful throughout every day.
The Holy Quran to life is my guide.